If you're just starting out as a software developer, there's one important decision that you need to make, one that's going to affect the rest of your career. And that's whether you're going to be a front-end developer or a back-end developer. In this video today, I'm going to cover which skills you need for each path, which one's easier to do, which one pays more in the long run, and which one I personally think you should pick. So let's get started. So let's have a look at the skills that you need for each of the roles. Front-end and back-end development tend to use two different types of skill sets, and as a result, they tend to suit two different types of people as well. To be able to do front-end development, you really need a good eye for design. It's not that you're going to be designing the application yourself, but you're going to be working quite closely with designers to bring their vision to life, and they're going to expect pixel-perfect precision out of your UI. If you want to be a front-end developer, you probably need more of an artistic brain than a logical one. It's great if you think logically as well, but because you're going to be working with the visual elements of an application, you need that sort of artistic view to make sure things look right, make sure the colors are correct, and make sure everything's in the right place. Front-end development tends to be a bit more customer focused. I mean, it makes sense. You're going to be working on the front end of an application that a customer is going to use. So you need to make sure that the application is built to the requirements that they have, as well as making sure that it's user-friendly to use. So you're going to be working quite closely with the UX designers, as user experience is really important. If you're working on a really small team, you might not even have a UX designer, and therefore the company might expect you to do that yourself. You need to make sure that anyone using your application is going to enjoy using it. You need to make sure that they can do what they need to without getting annoyed by the pop-ups or getting annoyed by the number of clicks they need to do a certain action. This is something you're going to be working closely with the user experience team, but again, if you haven't got a UX designer, then you're going to have to be doing that yourself. One of the skills that you really need for front-end development is being a quick learner. Let's say, for example, you're a React developer. I can't say that React is still going to be around in 10 years' time. Sure, there might be some legacy applications that are still being developed with it. If you want to be working on new, exciting applications, then you're going to need to know some of the new frameworks that are coming out. Of course, no one knows what's going to be the next React or the next Angular. So you really need to get used to learning all of these new frameworks that are coming out, at least having a basic understanding of each of them, and then keeping up to date with your industry and seeing which one's becoming more popular. Of course, all that time you spent learning React isn't completely wasted, because a lot of these frameworks are quite similar anyway under the hood, and it should be quite easy to switch between them. But you really need to be a quick learner to pick up all these frameworks and not be left behind. One of the things that I really like about front-end development is the instant gratification you get out of doing it. There's nothing like having two windows open, one with your front-end application and the other one with your code, and be able to see all the changes you make in real time. That's something that I really enjoy about front-end development. For back-end development, it's a completely different skill set. Obviously, you don't need the artistic abilities that you need for front-end development, but you really need a logical brain to think through the problems and solve them out in a logical order. Where front-end development is really customer-focused, back-end development is more about performance, maintainability and scalability. You need to make sure that the back end of your application isn't going to go down. It's going to be able to cope with the user requests, and it's not going to have a lot of errors either. Back-end developers really need to think about edge cases and working through all the different scenarios that are going to happen when someone is using your application. Is the application going to cope if the user enters in all zeros for one of the fields, or if the user doesn't enter in any field? Or what happens if the user enters in drop table, for example? You need to make sure that every single scenario is catered for and your application isn't going to break as a result. Really, the job of a back-end developer is to make sure that your application is robust. It can cope with a large amount of users using it. It can cope with people entering rubbish data. It needs to stay stable. It needs to run. It's not so much about customer experience, other than the fact that you don't want it to be slow, you want it to be fast. It's about making sure that the application does what you intend it to do and it doesn't break in the process. For back-end development, you really need to think in terms of what ifs. What if the user puts in rubbish data? What if the user doesn't put in any data at all? What if the number of requests you get in scales by 100? Is your application going to scale? These are the sort of questions you need to ask yourself when doing back-end development. Unlike front-end development, back-end development doesn't have that instant gratification factor. For back-end development, the satisfaction comes from being able to build out everything and running it the first time and having it work. That's usually a bit of a miracle, because generally you're going to get errors the first time you run your application. So when it comes to front-end development and back-end development, which one is easier? To be fair, they're both pretty hard. Now, if I really had to pick one, I would say that front-end development is easier. Now, before you go and have a go at me in the comments, hear me out. I would say there's probably less to learn in front-end development. Obviously, for front-end development, you need to know things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and your framework of choice inside out. And obviously you need to know things like the build tools that you use to build your website, and you need to be familiar with best practices on things like accessibility. And really that's the scope of what you need to learn. But the hard thing about front-end development is that most of what you learn and need to know is in the framework itself. It's knowing about the intricacies of React and how to build applications in React, which isn't going to be much use in 10 years' time when React isn't used anymore. Sure, the next framework might be similar, but you're going to have to relearn a lot of those things again. If you compare that to back-end development, the fundamentals that you're learning aren't going to change. For example, 10 years ago, everything I learned about back-end development is pretty much still useful today. Whereas for front-end development, I was using Knockout.js 10 years ago, which no one is using anymore. So even though I would say there's less to learn for front-end development, you do need to learn new frameworks quite regularly, and this obviously adds up a lot of time. For back-end development, the fundamentals don't really change, but I would say there's probably a lot more that you need to learn. So you obviously need to know things like how to build an API, authentication, caching. Backend development still uses libraries and frameworks like front-end development does, but it doesn't tend to have as much of an impact on your code base as it does for front-end developers. It's not the whole application, it is literally just a few lines of code, and it's a lot easier to switch between different libraries. The fact that the fundamentals just stay the same makes learning backend development easier, but there's a lot more to learn, which in general makes it harder. I think the issue with this is that the scope of what people consider to be back-end development is always changing. So front-end development is obviously the front end of application. Back-end development is therefore everything else. Now, obviously we do have roles like DevOps and database administrators and all these things. But in a lot of companies, it is literally just the back-end developer doing all of those different roles. For back-end development, you obviously need to know how to build an API, make sure it does what you need it to do, and make sure it's secure. But you also need to know things like database design, how to write efficient queries. You need to know CI/CD pipelines. You need to know the infrastructure as well, and how to make that infrastructure secure and scalable. On top of all that, you need to learn things like domain-driven design, microservices, and how to build an event-driven architecture. The good thing about backend development is everything you're learning now is going to be useful in 10 years' time. You don't need to keep relearning things like you do with front-end development. The thing is, with backend development, a lot of what you're going to be learning is on the job. It's very difficult to learn how to build a scalable application if you haven't got the traffic coming in to justify building it. It's the same for writing efficient SQL queries. You can't write a good query if you've only got 100 records in your database. It just doesn't work the same compared to one that's got 1 million records. Please let me know in the comments whether you agree with what I've said and whether you're planning on being a front-end developer or a back-end developer. Now, one aspect that a lot of developers care about is which one is going to pay more. Now, in my experience, both of the starting salaries for both positions is probably about the same. But over time, especially once you've got like 10 years experience, back-end developers generally get paid more. Now, I think a lot of this is as a back-end developer, your knowledge tends to accumulate and compound over time. You're not having to relearn new frameworks every 5 years. So if you've got 10 years experience, you actually have 10 years experience as a back-end developer. Whereas a front-end developer with 10 years experience might only have 5 years experience of React. Therefore, it's a lot easier to become a master back-end developer than it is to become a master front-end developer because you're constantly having to relearn new things. And as I mentioned before, the scope for a back-end developer is a lot larger, and therefore you're a lot more useful to the company than being a front-end developer. And as a result, you can command a higher salary. Now, a lot of this depends on the sort of company that you're working for. If you're working for a back-end focused, API-first company, then it makes sense that back-end developers are going to get paid a bit more. But if you're working on a more customer-focused application, then it might be that front-end developers get paid a lot more. From what I've seen at the companies I've worked at, the salary bands for front-end and back-end developers tends to be about the same, if not exactly the same. You tend to get a lot more senior back-end developers than you do senior front-end developers. A lot of this is because your experience compounds over time as a back-end developer. And because the scope of what you're working on tends to be a lot larger, so when the review period comes around, you have a lot more to talk about and to justify that senior promotion. It's also a lot easier for back-end developers to quantify how much of an impact they've had on the application and the company. As generally a back-end developer is focused on making things more performant, that is something that you can say in your review process to say, well, I've made this application 10 times faster than it was before, and therefore I'm saving the company this much money. For front-end development, if you have a lot of control and you're on a customer-focused project, then you may be able to have as much impact as a back-end developer does. If you take the Google example, one of the experiments they did was to change the color blue to see how it affects the click-through rate of their application. Obviously, if you're a front-end developer and you've got the permission to be able to change things like the color of buttons and be able to measure what the click-through rate is, then that is something that you can have a big impact on the company and you can bring up in your review process. For front-end developers, especially those working with a team of designers, it's going to be difficult to justify the impact they've had on a company, especially if all they're doing is taking a designer's work and making it into a React application. What you really need for a higher salary is ownership of the application that you're working on. So you need to take ownership of the work you're doing, making sure that it sees the results, and then be able to tell your manager in the performance review what impact you've had on the company. Back-end developers do tend to get paid a lot more, but it's only because they have to know an awful lot more as well. For some, the scope of what they need to learn can be a bit too much, and it's not uncommon to see developers being stuck at that mid-level role for their entire career and never progressing to a senior developer. So given the skills that you need to have and the pay that you're going to expect, depending on which path you pick, which one would I recommend? Now, really, you need to pick the path that's going to use your skill set best. If you're artistic, then you'd be better off as a front-end developer. If you're more logical, then you might be better off as a back-end developer. You essentially need to focus on trying to become an expert at whichever path you pick, and then the pay will come. As long as you enjoy what you're doing, that's what matters most, and you need to pick what is going to be best for you. You may have heard the expression, jack of all trades is a master of none, and people tend to use this as an excuse not to learn lots of different things. For example, as a front-end developer, you may decide that everything that's back-end related is not your job. You don't need to learn it, I don't want to do it. And the same goes the other way around. What many people don't know is this expression is actually misquoted. The full saying is, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but is oftentimes better than a master of one. So becoming a master at something is great, but not if it's at the detriment of everything else. If you take a brain surgeon, for example, you might think, well, they're a master of brain surgery. But of course, they've had to go through medical school to get that as well. So they're going to be a master of many things before they become a master of brain surgery. In software development, however, you don't want to be a master of one. If you spend all your time learning React and becoming a React master, what are you going to do when React isn't around anymore and people aren't using it? People tend to downplay generalists, but it's actually a lot more useful to be good at a lot of different things than it is to be a master of just one. For me, software development is about creating things. It's about having an idea and bringing that to life. Now, to be able to do this, you need to know lots of different areas of software development. You need to know a bit about front end so people can actually use what you've built. But knowing just front end isn't that useful. What good is an application that just sits there but doesn't actually do anything useful? You obviously need to know back end as well, but back end isn't that useful if you're trying to build a user-focused application. And of course, what use is front end and back end if all it does is sit on your computer? And therefore, you need to know a bit about DevOps to be able to put your creation onto a server so other people can use it. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to be an expert at all of these different areas. You just need to know a little bit. For me, I consider myself a back-end developer, but I know enough about the front-end development to build a UI that people will want to use. I know enough about DevOps to be able to deploy my application to the cloud so people can actually use it without being on my computer. For that reason, it's a lot better to be a generalist and take something from an idea to a product that people can actually use than it is to be a master of one thing and not be able to create anything useful. So I'm not saying you need to be a full stack developer. It's actually very difficult to be a senior full stack developer because it's just too much to learn. So whether you pick front end development or back end development, it's worth learning about the other side and all the different areas of software development so you can actually build something useful. Whichever one you pick, make sure you have fun with it. If you're not having fun, then try something else, try a different skill and see how you get on. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave a comment down below and don't forget to subscribe.